Welcome to another Sheriff of Sodium video. Today I'm going to share with you my talk from the NRMP's Transition to Residency meeting. This is from a session on preference signaling and whether that's something that we should broadly implement in residency selection. Of course, by preference signaling, what we're talking about is a system in which residency program applicants could use a token or send a signal to demonstrate their true and sincere interest in a particular program. And program directors could use those signals as a way of vetting applicants to decide who to interview. And this session was formatted as a debate. And Dr. Helen Morgan from the University of Michigan, already a big voice and a rising star in medical education, took the pro position, and I was tasked with taking the con. It was a very cool session, and I wish I could share the whole thing with you. We had contributions from faculty, deans, residents, and medical students on this issue. But of course, since this is the Sheriff of Sodium YouTube channel, I'm only going to be able to share with you my portion. Of course, if you follow me for any length of time, you know that preference signaling is a topic about which I've taken some interest and I've commented upon recently. Back in August, when the Otolaryngology Program Directors Organization announced that they would be implementing preference signaling in this year's match with a 5-signal system, I put out a post on my site, Preference Signaling Winners and Losers Edition. If you haven't read this post, I'll put a link in the notes below. If you have read it, you probably remember that I thought that preference signaling was probably a pretty good idea and something that's worth pursuing and studying this application season. Matter of fact, I have a lot of respect for the otolaryngology program directors for taking the lead on this and pushing through this initiative in what was likely to be the craziest application season that we'll ever see. The issue, of course, is that the match process has become increasingly chaotic. As applicants apply to more and more and more programs, program directors get increasingly overwhelmed and struggle to discern applicants with real, sincere interest in their program from ones who are applying to every single program in that discipline. Overwhelmed program directors rely on convenience metrics to screen applicants. Maybe they exclude applicants with USMLE scores below an arbitrary threshold, or maybe they use an ARIS filter to filter out osteopathic students, or IMGs, or applicants with a gap since their graduation year, or anyone that's outside a small number of prestigious feeder schools. And although these factors are probably not good predictors of an applicant's capability of performing in residency, they allow the program director to get their way through the pile. But the problem with these convenience metrics is that when all programs use these same readily available convenience metrics, they end up inviting the same applicants over and over and over. And as I've discussed before, there is evidence to show that just 12% of applicants in general surgery or in internal medicine, just 12% of all applicants consume 50% of interview spots. This is inefficient for programs. This is inefficient for applicants. It leads to less optimal matching and increases the stress for applicants and programs alike. So this is where formal preference signaling comes into play. Preference signals offer the promise, at least, of allowing interested applicants and programs to find each other more easily, and that would improve the match process for programs and applicants alike. Thing is, I'm not here today to extol the virtues of preference signaling. I'm here to tear the thing apart. And so with no further ado, I'm going to present to you the con argument that I used for the NRMP meeting. Here you go. This preference signaling sure sounds good, right? And obviously, I can't come up here and say to you today that things are going swimmingly, because they're not. Our applicants, our future colleagues, are engaged in an application arms race that has no natural end, and it leads to a reliance on convenience metrics that undermine the quality of medical education. Over-application benefits neither program directors nor applicants. The fact that we've tolerated it for as long as we have is shameful, and regardless of which side you come down on in this debate, I hope that anyone who is listening to me right now gets inspired to do something about all this. But is preference signaling with tokens really the thing that we need to do? And I'm going to argue not so fast, and I'm going to spend the next few minutes trying to convince you that we need to do better. That this kind of token system, if we broadly implement it, it's going to be gamed, and it's going to result in unintended consequences that are both predictable and inauspicious. Or even worse, it may result in ultimately increasing the number of applications that students submit. And instead, I'm going to argue to you that we need to think seriously about other solutions. Let's start by talking about unintended consequences. So Dr. Morgan cited in her talk a paper from the Journal of Graduate Medical Education that appeared last year. I'll link to it in the notes below. The paper basically did some computer modeling of preference signaling, and they showed that it worked pretty good. The trouble with computer modeling is that it doesn't account for human behavior, and it doesn't tell you what will happen when preference signaling is used iteratively in repeated application cycles instead of just a one-off. But here's the thing about that. Medical students are smart, and they will soon realize that the value of expressing a preference really is that it gives you an advantage in getting an interview. And so if you're smart and you want to maximize the number of interviews that you receive, where should you express your preference? You tell me. To a program that you're honestly interested in, but that you think you're likely to be given an interview whether you express preference or not? Or should you express your preference to a prestigious reach program where you might not be offered an interview without it? The correct answer is you signal the reach program. That's what a rational applicant would do to maximize his or her chance of matching. You send your token to the program that might not have given you an interview without it. And so if you imagine what the distribution of signals that each program receives is going to look like, it's probably going to look like something like this, where the more prestigious that a program is, the more tokens they're going to receive. Now, and this is the really insidious part, and so I want to make sure that you stay with me, but I want you to imagine what's going to happen when programs receive the signals if the distribution looks just like this one right here. And to think through this, let's use some real data. And so we'll stick with Dr. Morgan's specialty, which is obstetrics and gynecology. Now these days, the average OBGYN program receives 589 applications, and they only invite about 87 of those applicants on average, 15% of them, to interview. Now, in 2020, there were just a little over 2,000 active OBGYN applicants. So let's imagine that we give each of those applicants just two tokens, just two signals to send to programs to show their true and abiding interest in that program. We have 4,000 tokens in play. How many tokens do you think the quote-unquote top programs in OBGYN are going to receive? More to the point, do you think that number will be greater or less than 87? Because if the top programs receive more signals than they actually have interview invitations to extend, then something very insidious happens. The signaling mechanism gets used as a screening mechanism. So if I'm the program director at a prestigious institution and I get 100 applicants telling me that I'm their favorite program, why would I even look at the other applicants I received? I mean, why would I go chasing birds in the bush when there's so many birds right in my hand? And of course, as soon as applicants realize that in order to get an interview at a prestigious institution requires sending in a token, believe me, Student Doctor Network and Reddit are going to figure this out, and it will become a de facto requirement of applying to these programs. This distribution is going to shift even farther to the right, and the peaks over here are going to get even higher. And we're going to end up in a world of signaling haves and have-nots where the presence of a token isn't going to even give you very much information. And if that's where we end up, then preference signaling will go down as being ineffective. But we probably won't be really any worse off than when we started. But the thing is, that's not the only unintended consequence that could occur. And this next one should really give us pause about whether preference signaling with tokens is something that we want to pursue, because it may end up increasing the overall number of applications that students submit. And before I get into that, it's fundamental that we all understand why students apply to more and more programs each year. It's not because they lack information, or it's not because getting into residency is tougher now than it used to be, despite the messaging from certain national organizations who will remain nameless at this moment. It's because students are rational actors, and they're stuck in a game in which applying to more programs becomes their only rational move. You can model their payoffs of different application strategies in this 2x2 matrix. And in fact, this is adapted from a paper that appeared in the Journal of Graduate Medical Education a few years ago, and I'll link to that in the notes below as well. But basically, you have two applicants, applicant A and applicant B, and they are equal in every way, and they both want to match in their chosen specialty. So each applicant can choose to apply to fewer or more programs. And when he does, he'll get a certain payoff based on the choice that his opponent, applicant B, makes. So the payoff that I have listed here is the chance of going unmatched. So you can see if these two identical applicants both choose to apply to fewer programs, then they both end up with a 5% chance of going unmatched. On the other hand, if applicant A chooses to apply to fewer programs while applicant B chooses to apply to more, then applicant A is now stuck with a 10% chance of not matching, while applicant B has just a 2% chance of not matching. And when you model it like this, it's clear that this situation approximates a prisoner's dilemma, in which applying to more programs is a dominant strategy. Applying to more programs is the only way to achieve your best outcome, that 2% chance of going unmatched, and it's the only way of avoiding the worst outcome, which is that 10% chance of going unmatched. And the problem is that when both applicants make that rational decision to overapply, they both end up with a slightly higher chance of going unmatched. That's the 6% here. And this occurs because programs can no longer discern real interest, and they end up repeatedly interviewing the same pool of applicants that look good on paper. And this is, of course, exactly the situation that we're in right now. But what I want you to notice very clearly is that preference signaling does nothing to change the incentives here. All applicants are going to prefer matching to going unmatched. And all other things being equal, applying to more programs provides a relative advantage to an individual applicant. And so in fact, preference signaling may psychologically encourage students to submit even more applications. Because remember, students decide how many applications to submit based on what they perceive maximizes their probability of matching. And so if we designate certain applications as being special, a special application with a token on it, well then those applications become more valuable. But if all the regular, non-token, non-signaled applications, they all get systematically devalued. In fact, that might even lead to automated screen out, like I discussed on the previous slide. But if each regular application becomes less valuable, then a rational student quickly realizes that he or she needs to submit even more of them to achieve the same probability of matching as if all applications were treated identically. In other words, if you're making the argument that we need preference signaling because applicants overapply, then you may be throwing gasoline on the fire. We also need to be clear-eyed about the opportunity costs to pursuing preference signaling, because we need to be careful that we don't use up all of our capital on solutions that don't really get us where we want to go, especially when they come at the expense of pursuing something else. I admit a preference signaling system is appealing. I mean, in a world in which applicants have limitless applications and an incentive to overapply, I mean, preference signaling could make life easier. But the question is, do we have to live in such a world? Do we have to live in a world of limitless application? Could we not choose to live in a world where the simple act of submitting an application could be viewed as a credible signal of interest that yes, the applicant actually wants to go to that program? Of course, if you want to come with me and build this world, that's going to require implementing application caps. And so maybe instead of making a complicated workaround that just enables applicants to continue to overapply but gives programs a way of being able to ignore some of the overapplication, why don't we just get right at the root of the problem? The answer to this question, I think, has less to do with what's good for medicine and more to do with the legal system and financial incentives. And I've talked about this before, and look, I'm not an attorney, and it's well beyond my expertise to opine much on this topic, but there is a certain likelihood that a fixed cap on applications would result in a legal challenge based on restraint of trade laws. The idea is that by arbitrarily imposing a restriction on the number of jobs that a person can apply for, we would be inappropriately restraining that person's ability to ply their trade. Thing is, we restrain trade all the time, and the law allows ways for that to be done. I mean, look, there's a reason I can't sell you my kidney, or choose to hire employees for less than a minimum wage, or to corner the market on a particular good. We restrain trade all the time, and there's a standard for doing it. Restraint of trade is allowed if that restraint is reasonable, if it's limited, if it serves a legitimate interest that is not contrary to the public interest. And so if application caps were challenged legally, they may well prevail, but we would have to have the willingness to articulate that argument in court and show why application caps do fit that standard. And we'd have to have the willingness to pay for that battle instead of just resigning ourselves to bleed to death from 1,000 small cuts. But if we decide that we don't have the stomach to defend a reasonable position in court, then guess what? There's a ready-made alternative, Dr. Maya Hamoud's Early Result Acceptance Program. It would be sort of analogous to undergraduate college admissions early decision programs. But the key thing is that it's voluntary. You can participate or don't. So you can't complain that somebody's restraining your trade. You just participate or don't. Now, there's still concerns that a system like this would unfairly impact couples or would lead to gaming by programs, but that's getting beyond the scope of my talk. And before we come up with a new way of preference signaling, we should probably ask ourselves if the old ones are really that bad. I mean, remember, applicants signal their preference to programs all the time in many different ways, and some are better and more fair than others, but some of them might be able to be adapted to be more fair and useful. Think, for instance, about away rotations. What if we redesign the away rotation system into a fair exchange system so that instead of just perpetuating this arms race where students have to do more and more away rotations and pay through the nose, just in order to match, we could allow all students to have a couple of opportunities to rotate at another institution and have an audition for their residency training. But if you still decide that you want to pursue preference signaling, then there's one other thing that you should think carefully about, and that's how the signals themselves are configured. You give applicants too many tokens, and each one becomes devalued. You give applicants too few tokens, and you ignore applicants that sincerely are trying to get your attention if you're a program. But whatever number of signals you choose to allow applicants, there's going to be somebody who has sincere, heartfelt interest in N+1 programs. And there's going to be someone else who has real interest in N-1 programs, but they're going to send tokens to all N programs because why not? So what if instead of making signaling a binary variable where an applicant either sends one or doesn't, what if we made it a continuous variable? Suppose we had a system where each applicant got 100 points, and we required that they allocate to each program to which they apply a certain number of points. But you decide how many. So you could have an applicant like applicant A who chooses to apply to 40 programs, and she might choose to allocate 9 of her 100 points to her top choice program. And she could send 8 points to the programs that were pre-interview number 2 and number 3 on her list, and maybe 5 points to the other programs in her top 10, and 1 or 2 points to the other programs in which she has some interest. But consider how a system like this might help an applicant like applicant B, who applies to just 28 programs, but honestly only has 3 programs that he's seriously interested in. Maybe he has a significant other who lives near those places. And so this applicant might give 25 points to each of those top 3 programs and just 1 to the other programs on the list. I mean, 25 points, that's going to catch the program director's attention, right? But where this really becomes valuable is in a situation like applicant C, an applicant who's over applying. Applying to 120 programs, this one is. But unlike in our standard system where each one of this applicant's applications are indistinguishable, because he has a finite number of points to allocate, he's forced to assign a smaller and smaller number of points to programs that are farther down on the list. I mean, he can still apply to as many programs as he wants, but he has to be honest about the fact that he has little particular interest in any of them. And at a certain point, when he does this calculus, he may find that it's more valuable to apply to a smaller number of programs where he has a realistic chance of admission so that he can provide more of a signal to each. It's only by using a system of continuous preference signaling that we can provide some disincentives to over-application. This is my last slide, and here I wanted to set the stage for the panelist discussion in the session. And this is the thing that everybody has to remember as we consider all of this. This is figure 1 from the NRMP's main residency match report. It shows the difference between the total number of applicants in the green curve and the total number of positions available in the purple curve. We have more applicants than we have residency positions. But even if the green and purple curves were merged, unless we had the exact distribution of specialties and geographic locations that applicants wanted, there's still going to be winners and losers in the match process. And if you consider residency selection just from the standpoint of an individual applicant, it is a zero-sum game. You can use preference signals, you could allow unlimited away rotations, you could cap applications or don't. The point is, one person's going to be advantaged and one person's going to be disadvantaged. One person's going to win and one person's going to lose. And you can always make the case that a particular change that you're making is going to disadvantage someone. Because if one applicant gets what they want, another applicant doesn't. And when you make that kind of argument, you're making a shallow argument. What we need to consider is not whether a change that is made will benefit a particular applicant or not. It is whether it will improve the system overall. Does it make the system more fair to use formal preference signaling, or does it make it more fair to just allow well-connected applicants to use their personal networks to send signals? Is it more equitable that we give everyone the same number of applications? Or should we give an advantage to people who are willing to spend more or go into more debt on their ARIS fees? We have to think seriously about the systemic costs and benefits of the policies that we implement, because if you look at it from a systemic or a societal standpoint, this is not a zero-sum game. We have a chance with the policies that we create to make things better for our students and our schools and our patients, but to do that, we have to be thoughtful and choose wisely. That's all I've got. Thank you for listening.